Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. Welcome to part 2 of the 7 deadly sins of community development with Charlie McConnell, a retired community educator based in London, and Professor Paul Lachapelle from Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana, both of whom were past presidents of the International Association of Community Development. Before you listen to this, it is probably worth listening to part 1, which was episode 41 of the podcast, in which Charlie and Paul set out their rationale, their motive for writing the paper of the same name that appeared a little bit earlier this year in the Journal of the Community Development Society. There is a link to the paper in the show notes. And in that episode, they also introduced the first of the deadly sins, anti-expertism, locality and self-help, and an overemphasis on social capital. Let's stride across the halfway line. We go from 3 to 4 of the 7. And this is probably one I think you probably let off a bit lightly, in my personal view. 7, an over-righteous NGO sector, non-governmental organisational sector, charity sector, international development sector. It might be known by different terminologies, different acronyms.
Well, I've been wanting to say this one for years, absolutely for years. I maybe should have put it number 1. And there's a little story behind it. In the turn of the millennium, just before I went into government, I was chief executive of the national government agency that supported community education and development in Scotland. I think we were doing really great work. And the new devolved administration came in when we had a new parliament and government. And often when new governments come in here in Britain, Paul, I don't know if you know the term, they have a bonfire of the quangos. Quangos are quasi-autonomous NGOs, which means they are set up often by governments and they're funded by governments, but they act arm's length from government. Now, we were a quango. Our board was appointed by the government, and a lot of our funding came from government. And at the top of the campaign list, and it was published in the main newspapers in Scotland, part of a big campaign led by the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations, and you can see what that organisation represents. It said, "Burn the quangos," and we were at the top of it. And I thought, we're accountable to the Scottish Parliament, we're accountable to the Scottish Government, we were reviewed regularly, etc. And the Parliament and the Government are democratically elected. Who are you accountable to? Often voluntary organisations are sort of self-selecting, they don't have a democratic mandate, they have often white, male, middle-class boards. They're not necessarily the great champions of social justice that they like to see themselves. Some are absolutely the champions of social justice, but not necessarily all of them. They're neither a democratic mandate nor as accountable as they should be, and they're not necessarily progressive. Indeed, when you look at it, there are foundations and NGOs in the States, foundations that fund the right-wing and populist TV and radio stations and newspapers and social media. They spend a lot of money on lobbying in Congress to stop progressive things happening. So non-governmental money, non-governmental organisations are not necessarily progressive. Many are, but many are not. Also, I think this over-righteousness that they claim to speak for civil society, well, what necessarily gives them the right? And who else are members of civil society? It's not just you lot. And I think when I was looking at this, I just wanted to sort of put them up and put the spotlight on the NGO sector, because I think this self-righteousness has also encouraged a bit this anti-statism, this privatization agenda that we got in the 80s over here and other countries have had around the world. And often it's the NGO sector that move in and take over the running of the social services or the health services that used to be publicly owned and publicly run. Some do fantastic work, brilliant work, and proud to work as partners with them, but don't be over righteous. You know, your partners in community development, you're not the only people doing community development.
No, I think it's well said, and I think, you know, you cast a light on, you know, some of their employment practices as well, where, you know, in essence, some of them are just mimicking the sort of non-unionised, short-term, low-paid forms of employment that international corporations are involved in. You know, one of the reasons why some communities, you know, find themselves in the situation that they are because of, you know, insecure work and the like. And I think that's a point that's very worthwhile making. Probably should say as well, I mean, it's a paper in an academic journal. You know, there are citations here, so there is evidence that is being quoted. I mean, you know, people are welcome to obviously read the paper themselves for the sources and the citations. But this isn't just mere opinion. This is backed up in the paper with evidence. Paul, I mean, is this something that you find, or you are inclined to think is across the piece? It's something that you'll find in, you know, on all continents. Would it be something that, you know, all members maybe of IECD listening to this would be nodding their head in agreement or recognition of?
You know, I guess my response is, I think this one sin could have been a focus of an entire paper, or maybe even a semester's class. Boy, there's a lot to digest with this one. And, you know, I see we really didn't go into much detail about kind of the legacy of neoliberalism. And Charlie in particular could have waxed poetic, you know, about this one, just given his lengthy experience, work experiences over the years with the NGO sector. You know, I guess my observation here is, and my concern, kind of going back to the work that I'm doing now in climate justice, specifically looking at pedagogy and in universities and in institutions of higher education, is my concerns, and we mentioned this briefly, my concerns with transparency and opportunities for participation and inclusion. Certainly some NGOs, INGOs are better about and conscious of, but there's a real concern that I have, that I've seen in the NGO sector and certainly outside the NGO sector with issues of transparency, access to data, access to internal communications and kind of mission statements and overall goals and objectives. And this, of course, is a primary component of the climate justice framework, are issues of transparency and participation. So I'm glad that we were able to highlight this. It was a bit cursory in just the short section that we were able to provide some commentary about this. But again, maybe this is the follow-up article, Charlie, that you and I can work on. But I feel that this is a big apple to take a bite out of, and we really just scratched the surface.
Well, if you want a third person to throw some pebbles into the pond and create some ripples, then let me know. I'm minded of the phrase, I think it was when I was sort of back as a graduate, undergraduate, the political geographer Bob Jessup, you know, I think it was him that first introduced me to the concept of this, the hollowing out of the state. And it's not just underfunding, it's about taking services from, you know, traditional public bodies and giving them to others. And some of those are NGOs, and the NGO sector has done very, very well for itself out of that process of hollowing out, frankly. And I'm also minded of, when I was reading the paper, I was minded of Professor Dave Adamson, who's now retired. I think Dave's residing in Australia, but was working in South Wales, and was very keen to stress, which I think you do, it's one of my takeaways from this part of the paper, is that, you know, partnership between governments, non-government agencies, the private sector, universities, and so on, find the best model for delivery and sort of go with that, rather than this assumption that it must always be public and state, or it must always be privatized, or whatever. And it's to find the best way, you know, within that partnership approach. And he was always very keen to emphasize that within, you know, some of the debates around community development that we were having in the early 2000s around, how do we improve the lot for disadvantaged communities in Wales, where we were working. Yes, the local council has got a role to play. Yes, the National Health Service does. Yes, the police do. But then so do, large private employers and so on. So, yeah. Number 5, an overemphasis upon collectivism. This might be one I think people kind of raise their eyebrows at from within the sector if they were reading it or when they get to read it. You mentioned that the Berlin Wall, Charlie. What's the relevance of that?
Well, I was working with the Community Development Foundation at the time, and I was over at some conference or another in Germany, and the wall was just being breached. I thought, I've got to be there. So I was a few days late, but my God, there was an atmosphere. But that whole era actually was a very exciting, stimulating one in community development in Europe, because we were discovering civil society players in Central and Eastern Europe who were doing really a lot of what we've been doing, and we had a wonderful dialogue going on there. But I remember talking with these guys at the Hungarian Association for Community Development, and they said, why do you prefix your development work with the word community? Because over here in the tradition of communism, that means compulsory volunteering. So they were sort of slightly iffy about it. I mean, in fact, we broke the ice on that one. But I'd just like to point to, about 30 years ago, I wrote a book called The Making of an Empowering Profession, a title I've used in other publications as well. But I had a foreword very kindly from a guy called Kenneth Alexander. And Ken Alexander chaired a very seminal committee in the mid-70s in Scotland called the Challenge of Change. And it's basically set up the community education services and brought together a lot of big push on community work and adult education, etc. in Scotland. It's seen as one of the sort of origin books of the field up there. And he wrote, I'll just quote it to you, on the perceived conflict within an educational philosophy between emphasis on the individual and the group, our report recognised the success of all community education depended on the response of individual minds, but that individual minds could benefit from collaboration with others and from developing a shared problem-solving approach to shared situations. And I just want to hone in on there, because if you read a lot of community development literature, actually if you look at the IACD website these days, you see words like community development's about collective empowerment, about collective action, about collective outcomes. And of course, yes, it is. It's about people working together to get improvements in their lives and to be able to deal with change in a more resilient way, etc., to have more power. But community development as an intervention is about working with individuals. You're working with individual community activists or community leaders. In any community education work, you're dealing with individual minds there, sat in the room, as well as working together to solve problems together, to try to get a collective solution to something. And what I found us is underplaying is the work with the individuals. If you look at some of Alinsky's work in state, in America, or on community action, and you look at his books on this, he's all about, you just got to work with a few group. You're not going to get a mass involvement to bring about change. It's like the Margaret Mead stuff. It is about sometimes working with a few group of activists, and then others get involved at different points. It may be a community festival, or it may be marching in a street, or whatever it is. But often community development is about working with a small group of individuals. But we've somehow felt embarrassed about terms like leadership and that side of it. And certainly as a development educationalist, which I consider myself at, I'm working with individuals and groups, and I've just felt we've downplayed the individual side of the work and the thinking out of the box that individuals can often bring to groupthink. But maybe, Paul, you want to build on that?
What intrigues me about this section, Charlie, is and I just think to how blessed I am as a professor working in a university to be able to work one-on-one with students and to cultivate that kind of and to see that kind of growth, that personal and professional growth happening right before our eyes as professors. And I think that this is kind of what we're getting at is kind of cultivating this personal and this individual maturity, I guess, to be able to work with the collective. But it starts with the individual. And while I enjoy teaching in the classroom to a group of several dozen students, what really is satisfying is that one-on-one work and that small group work where you can really see the individual in these university settings change and mature, and you're kind of cultivating the change that and the ability for individuals to first of all realize their own personal and professional potential, and then be able to go out and work with others. So I guess that's the observation and the point of view that I brought to this section.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really strong part of the paper. It recognises that that people have their individual agency, their own motivations and their own aspirations, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, no matter how much we want them to, work together and in partnership and to collaborate and help each other out. I think it's a point that's well worth making, because it isn't, I think, as you say, Charlie, it's not particularly prominent in the contemporary literature. Like you said, maybe you've got to go back to your Alinsky's to see it a little bit more prominent.
So let's celebrate both, and let's make sure community development practitioners also have the skills to work with groups and to work with individuals out in the community, etc. Let's celebrate both, highlight.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the work that Everett Rogers did. I mean, his Rogers curve, and it's been around for years, and people see maybe slightly different variations of it, and it's been maybe tweaked a little bit here and there. But I think the basic premise kind of pretty much holds true, is that it takes a small number of what he called innovators, the change makers, the people who are prepared to kind of stick the head above the parapet a little bit, to get an idea going, to get a movement going, to rattle a few cages, and then you have these early adopters who kind of go, yeah, I like what these people are saying. I get that, I understand that. I'll get involved too, and slowly then these innovations, these progressive movements, slowly diffuse through a population. But you don't need to work with everybody. I mean, I think that's where perhaps that sort of stuff and Alinsky really kind of that's where there's a confluence, where they dovetail. Then that's the word. Because it's recognising, well, actually, I just need to find a handful of people. They can create the conditions for change, and then other people will get involved. And as you say, maybe for a short period of time, and then they drop out. Indeed, some maybe the innovators themselves drop out. They've moved on to something else. Or, Rogers talked about how sometimes these people can actually be difficult individuals. They maybe don't find relating to other individuals particularly easy. That's the job of other people, to push the idea out of the nest. No, it's a fantastic area that I'm quite interested in. Let's rattle on, conscious of time. Discipline capture. You talked about academic capture a little bit earlier, Paul. What are we capturing in this one, or Charlie, whoever's going first?
It's always irritated me, this one. Again, in a lot of the literature and at conferences and things, people see the word community work and community development as the same thing. It's community workers that do community development. These are synonymous terms. It's a really lazy use of the English language. It's rather, there's so many, it's because we prefix so many things with the word community, of course, but these days. Community work, it's a number of things, isn't it? It can be an occupation, a community worker. Community work can also be, as we heard recently from our soon-to-be departed Prime Minister, it could be national service. Get young people out doing community work. It could be that you're a criminal and you're doing community work in order to not go to prison or something. It's such a loose term. But community workers at community work conferences, they always equate it. I've heard it in Ireland, I've heard it in the UK and in other countries. Community development is an approach. Community workers can adopt a community development approach. They can also adopt a community service model, purely providing services within the community. A community development approach is a participative development approach where skilled participant development practitioners work in dialogue, in partnership with the people in whatever community that they're working with. And a whole range of occupations can use a community development approach. Architects could use it, community architects. Artists and cultural workers can use it. Social workers can use it. Adult educators can use it. Economic development workers use it. Environmental practitioners can use it. Agriculturalists. There are a whole range of people that could use a participative community development approach. We talk about what that approach is in the IACD Rutledge book, International Community Development Practice. And there again, in the introductory chapter there, I draw this distinction. Community work is one of many occupations that can adopt a community development approach, but they do not dominate the field. And if you look at the competencies required to be a community development practitioner, if you look at participative action research, that wasn't invented by community workers. If you look at participative planning, that came from people like Arnstein, Sherry Arnstein, who worked she was a health researcher. If you look at the community organising, that didn't just come from community workers. So what I'm saying is that we don't need a particular, and it's not helpful for a particular discipline to try and capture our terrain. And I think by doing that, they've actually damaged us, because a community development approach can offer an enormous amount to public agencies, NGOs, whatever, government departments, etc. Because you're harnessing, and this also brings me to the fact, because it has been captured by a small occupation or discipline, it tends to only find its way in the higher education training of that small discipline. Wouldn't it be great if community development training also appeared in the training of architects, appeared in the planners of environmentalists and of agriculturalists and of planners or whatever? It is an approach. It is not a single occupation, and it's just really unhelpful in the way we try and explain this developmental approach in order to secure funds and investment and resources and get other professionals on board, bringing their expertise and an added value expertise in being not just one thing, but I've also got community development expertise as well. How powerful that could be.
Maybe I'll take it one step further, and it's an approach, but it's also a paradigm, and maybe a paradigm shift that's required, and and a mindset. I'm witnessing this again as an academic in a university, as our departments, we tend to be very siloed. We tend to compete for resources. We don't do a very good job often of doing multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary work across departments because of that competition. And I think I see that reflected in the in community development undergraduate and graduate programs. As our departments are siloed, this approach of community development also becomes siloed. And so I think that we have a lot of work to do in academia to also address this disciplinary capture, just because of the nature of how our universities are set up and financed.
Shall I move on to the last of these 7 deadly sins? And it's one that I very much echo, and I think is probably one of my bugbears that I see all too often: self-effacement. And you started by saying it's not helpful to overclaim, but neither is it to downplay the contribution that community development practitioners and programs can provide. And it's probably something that I spent the best part of 15 years on a program in Wales grappling with, individually but collectively, a lot of us impact, and then the imposition of performance frameworks and evaluation frameworks and all those sorts of things. And I don't know, I just wonder whether we get a little bit kind of lost in amongst all of that.
Some listeners will remember, I hope, Marge Mayo. She was a pioneer here and internationally in the role of women in community development. And I remember going to a conference run by the Community Development Journal. It was their 50th anniversary conference, and she was the keynote speaker. And she said, I've sometimes found it difficult because in our writings, we're saying we're all about promoting justice and equality and all these sort of high-powered things and rights. But actually, in my practice, I'm running bingo clubs. Now, she was clearly polarizing it, but it's high hopes and small realities. In fact, if you say community development's approach, then those realities can be very, very significant indeed, where, as Paul said, if you get a whole load of disciplines involved, it can be very, very powerful indeed. And what I also find, well, two things. I both worked as a government funder in that previous role that I had, but I also ran a foundation, Carnegie Foundation, where we funded community development programs. And in both cases, you'd ask for evaluative reports and you'd ask them to explain what they, in order to get further funding. And what I realized is that they really could do with a dose of expertise on how you market and sell what you've done, and really, really sell it in words that people can understand and that your audience can listen to. I mean, after all, bear in mind, we've got to get into the heads of the people that we're working with. And that includes getting into the heads of the power holders and the fund, of funds or whatever, or policies. And the other side, there's one level I think our field is very bad at selling itself, explaining itself, marketing itself, even though there are probably some brilliant people who can design podcasts and do community arts and festivals or whatever that could explain what we're about. We don't really use that anywhere near enough. The written word, the film, all these sorts of things. But the other one is just for us to recognise, and I don't think when you're on the other side, if you like, when you're a guerrilla working within a foundation, working within government to try and open those institutions up as well, you have to recognise that the civil service, for example, they have poor memories, poor institutional memories. So reports come out and they may be read, maybe cursorily read, and then filed. And if you get a change of personnel leading that department or that section that's responsible for funding, they're not going to go back and read all these reports on the wonderful work that was done in the past. So somehow we've got to work our way through that. We've got to understand the nature of the institutions that are the power and resource holders and how we can communicate with them effectively and try and get on the inside a bit more. So that was part of my thing, is we've got to start to sort of look upwards, and we've got to focus as much attention on engaging more effectively with the power and the resource holders. Because it does come back to my view that I think a lot of good community development work is not just an approach or a process or whatever. It is bringing real improvements in people's lives. And that often comes from bringing resources. And a good community development practitioner has got to be someone who's had some training and some expertise in knowing how the hell I can get these resources and how the hell I can prepare my reports and my evaluation reports on the work that I've done and tell them, look, we've done some significant work here. Don't you realise the cost effectiveness of what we've been doing? So I'm saying some people are very good at this and some are very poor at it. That's my bugbear.
No, I think you're right, and I share that. I think, and I think as well, it's where storytelling, I think, it can be really, really valuable, because it's something that's innate in all of us. Whether we're a civil servant, whether we're a politician seeking re-election, whether my 10-year-old son who I picked up from the school gate just before we were recording, and he's telling me about his day. He's doing it through stories, telling me this happened, and then his friend Mason said this, and then this happened, and and I think stories are really, really powerful for that. And I think we sometimes lose sight of that, but also perhaps it's maybe something that we don't necessarily keep honed, that the craft of telling a good story, because they appeal to us both as tellers and listeners of them. And I think that's one of the mediums that we underplay the value of.
I mean, it's a sort of plural marketplace in a way, and some messages break through, and they're messages we don't like, but they get funding. And we know they're wrong, and we know these are going to be damaging policies and practice. So it's about breaking through, somehow breaking through. I think that's why sometimes the language we use, the plain English we need to use, is absolutely vital. Tell the story to various listeners, various audiences.
But there lies one of the other darker sides to all of this, isn't it? Is, well, sometimes you've just got to say what works because it gets the resources in, because it turns on that tap of some funding or whatever. It's Paul, what have you got to say on the issue of self-effacement?
I can't help but think of this passage in the Beatitudes. The meek may inherit the earth, but they don't make very good community development practitioners. we need to be less modest, and as we say in the paper, to be very bold with our aims and with our goals and celebrating our work. Maybe just to kind of conclude this point, I think our association, the Community Development Society that I'm a member of, and also the IACD, which I'm also a member of, the International Association for Community Development, we do a very good job of celebrating our colleagues and our work. We do it informally and we do it formally with awards and recognitions. And I wanted to just point out that Charlie McConnell was the recipient of the Community Development Society's 2023 International Community Development Award. It's a very prestigious award, and it was very deserving. And but these are the kinds of things I think that we need to publicize. Is the good work that we're doing of our of individuals and teamwork that's going on, and I think our respective associations and societies are starting to do a good job of promoting that work and highlighting the individuals that are so deserving of that of the spotlight.
And at the risk of sort of breaking the fourth wall a little bit here, I mean, isn't this what things like podcast media or YouTube channels, whatever one's medium of choice is, isn't that this kind of like one of those ways of doing this a little bit more, I think, rather than just, describe what one has done, but talk about the impact that they've had, that they think they're having, and use it as a medium to tell those stories, to tell other people, reach other people, appeal to other people about what it is that we do. Organically generating this sort of content as well, and doing it when we want to do it, when we think there is the right time, not when the report is due, when the civil servants are demanding at the end of the quarter, end of the financial year, or whatever, or the funders, I think is an important part of it as well. So is this me not being self-effacing or trying not to be?
You're quite right then. I mean, we have to play the game with the funders. Of course we have to. We've got to know how to be good at that. But podcasts can be incredibly powerful. I mean, we do. I think most people speak far more clearly in a podcast than they write in a journal or in a book. And I found far too many academics in our field, once they get on a podcast, they're great. There's an interactive relationship with them, and you can have a discussion. You're challenged, as we are by you, Russell, and have been, Paul and I, when we were writing this article. But often when you read community development textbooks, you think, oh my God, this is just utterly unintelligible. I really feel for the poor undergraduate. My daughter had to go through some of the stuff. And oh God. And I can tell you, policymakers and funders sadly do not read the stuff in our academic journals. They don't. And therefore it is beholden on all of us to because there's some brilliant stuff in those journals, to think, well, how can we communicate these findings, this canon of literature, in a more effective way? I think that's what we're talking about. Just at one level, be proud of what we're doing, which is exactly what Paul and you have been saying, but also tell the story in a plainer, simpler, more visual or a sound-based way, or whatever that might be.
I think one of the things that podcasts do offer is an authenticity of voice, and I think back, Paul, to when we did those episodes for the IACD. We had people from all over the world literally contributing, from Mongolia, from India, from Australia, from Scotland, from Hong Kong, the US, Canada. So you had this richness of authentic voices, people talking about what they were doing. So I suppose it's an element of a mixed economy as well, and it's not just the one single podcast. It's lots of people doing lots of podcasts, and there being maybe an embarrassment of content to want to engage with and listen to. But then what you also tend to find, if you look at it through what I would call a community media kind of paradigm, then is that what you tend to find is the opportunity to collaborate, people coming on different people's podcasts, so you grow that that community. Then I think that's what it is, of people who are producing their own content in that kind of independent way, notwithstanding how the algorithms work and operate to get the podcasts in front of people on their phones. Nothing is truly independent in this way, but it's not having to go through an editorial board. It's not having to go through a chain of command necessarily. I'm not saying those things are inherently a bad thing. Things like academic journals, then clearly you need them, and people talking in a professional capacity. But I think it's an opportunity to talk in a bit more of a relaxed way when people are taken off the work lanyard or the work badge, as it were, but still in an informed and in a motivated way, because I think I said before we started recording properly, for a large part of us doing this sort of work, it's a vocation. It's more than just a job, basically. So yes, we got a little bit meta there at the last one, didn't we? There's also to use the clunky jargon, a nice feedback loop at the end of this one, where you're talking about how expertise angst, and again that worry, that maybe that preference for us falling back into that habit of anti-expertism, preferring to remain in the dark shadows, quote unquote, in the paper, preferring to publicise people power. We do ourselves a disservice. So nicely kind of loops back on itself at the end, this paper. One final plug: it was out last year, Journal of the Community Development Society. I'm not sure if there's a particular issue or volume number. But if you look for Charlie McConnell, Paul Lachapelle, The 7 Deadly Sins of Community Development, I'm sure you'll find it. I think we should probably wrap it up there, because we've been talking for long enough, in a self-effacing manner or otherwise. Anything else that you want to give a plug to? Anything else you're involved in or you want to bring to people's attention? Paul, yourself over in Montana?
Just how much I appreciate this opportunity to engage. Always enjoy interacting with Charlie. Charlie's just been a wonderful colleague and mentor and friend. Having an opportunity to talk freely about about the work that we're so passionate about is always so welcome. Charlie and I have faced kind of some pushback in our respective careers in terms of kind of this cancel culture, suppression or censorship, and this is really, it's counter to the work that we do as community developers and to our work as educators and community members. And so just having this opportunity is so appreciated. So thank you so much for allowing us the time to talk and vent and have a little bit of fun too.
Oh, you're very welcome, Paul. You're very welcome. Look after yourself, particularly with those fires that you mentioned earlier. That sounds a bit worrying and alarming. And Charlie, thank you for your contributions, and look after yourself out on those commons when you're out walking. And don't encounter any bears. No, you don't get the bears. Paul gets the bears, doesn't he? That's right. Final words, Charlie?
It was fun to write this article. As always, Paul, a great joy to work with you. I miss you, mate. And Russell, a real joy. This is my first podcast with you. I love the series. Keep going. I suppose it just made me think, being retired now, but I wonder to what extent use of the media, practical use of media, is a core module within the training of community development practitioners, because it could be useful in so many parts of your work.
The Decentered Media podcast that's run by my friend Dr. Rob Watson, I think would be a very, very good place to start for any of that sort of thing. Does some terrific work in Leicester, Documentary Media Centre there in the East Midlands of England.
But does it find its way into undergraduate training? Wouldn't it be so good, maybe alongside a course on Freire and Ilinska, that you actually do one on hands-on one on different forms of media that you can use in your practice?
Maybe there's a conversation to be had off this. I know Rob listens, I think, most episodes, possibly all the way through. You'd have to have listened all the way through to this one if he's to hear this bit. Definitely something there. I think by his own admission, he's a recovering academic as well. And again, it's that when I referred earlier to that kind of community media sort of paradigm, it's only largely thanks to him that I've understood kind of like more conceptually about what a podcast is and why it is and what it does and who it reaches and things like that. And he's helped me kind of construct the kind of like the more kind of conceptual, philosophical kind of apparatus around these things. Which is not to say that I like having the conversations and recording them and putting them out there for people to listen to, just because I find people like yourselves interesting to chat to and I find it stimulating. I always learn things. So, but if and when one is inclined, you can maybe look at it through a slightly different lens as well. And Rob has been great at that. So, maybe there's something to be said there. But I would love for, whether it's IECD or whether it's out of undergrad and postgrad institutions and courses, I would love to be scrolling through my podcast streaming app of choice, and for there to be more content related to this sort of thing. And sadly, there's not a huge amount out there. It's one of the reasons why I started doing it in, I guess, dare I say, in good traditional sort of community development style. If it's not there, go and build it yourself, and see who comes along with you on the journey. That was one of the motivations, if not the main motivation, for doing it. So so the offer's there. If you know of other people who want to come on and talk about their practice, then there's always an opportunity to come and chat. I'm speaking to someone from Fallin near Stirling in a couple of months for an episode. I've got an episode with some folks in Canada around community wealth building that needs editing. So it's an open invitation, and if you like it, then you can support it via Patreon. That helps as well. But just search for the Community Development Podcast on patreon.com. I don't say this enough, actually. Probably need to push this a bit harder. Self-effacing, you see, that's the problem. I'm rattling on now and I'm waffling, so I think we should call it a day. It's almost the end of the day for you and I, Charlie. Paul's got the rest of his day in front of him. But thank you once again to both of you, and look forward to doing this again sometime with one or other or both of you.
What a great pleasure. Thank you. And come visit. The door's always open for both of you.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at CommDevT CommDevT podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.